Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is the 200th episode of my weekly Casual Friday podcast. Every year for the past 4 years, I have uploaded 50 Casual Friday podcasts. Every week, I share with you what is going on in my knitting life, as well as in my textile life in general. For the past 2 years, I've started the podcast with what I call tidbits. These tidbits are an introduction to a topic that has either come to me across my social media feed or which I have encountered from doing my own research. These tidbits might be books, they might be academic articles, journals or conferences, videos or blog posts, or even news articles. Every week I get comments from knitters who tell me how much they enjoy the tidbits, and especially how much they enjoy the tidbits related to knitting and textile history, and the fun that they have following the links I provide down in the show notes. So for this 200th episode of Casual Friday, and as a way to say goodbye to 2021, I have compiled 15 history-related tidbits from this year's podcasts for you to revisit if you've been watching all year, or for you to explore for the first time if you're new to the channel. As always, I include links related to the tidbit topics down in the show notes. And if you would like to jump right to a specific point in the video, you can tap or mouse over the video playback area of your screen to reveal the chapter titles and starting points of each section. So let's get started. This next tidbit came to me, I believe it was in my Instagram feed, and it's an article, which I will link to below, about the world's oldest thread that was discovered. And it was discovered in a site that was a Neanderthal site. So this was not only a remarkable discovery for how old it is, because it's 52,000 years old. The next oldest piece of thread that our scientists have found, or archaeologists have found, is 19,000 years old, because these threads, fabric, those kinds of things decompose and there's nothing remaining. So you can only speculate when the idea of spinning fibers into thread or cord might have been created. So this is evidence of not only that it was at least 52,000 years ago, but it was Neanderthals that were doing that. So that tells us that the Neanderthals had math skills and complex thinking, particularly since the fibers that they would have used were bast fibers. They were harvested from underneath the bark of a specific type of tree, which could only be done at certain times of year. So that they had to know all of these things. Then they had to know that they could twist these fibers together in one direction to create a single thread. And then if they combined 3 of them together, they'd have to twist them in the opposite direction in order to create the thread. That's some complex thinking going on. The thread, they're describing it as being roughly equivalent to lace weight yarn that we would use today, but it was a 3-ply, so there are 3 plies in the thread. But I'll leave that article, link to the article, down in the show notes. This next tidbit came to me, I think, also as a link from my Twitter feed. It is a link to an academic journal, an abstract of an article that appears in the academic journal. And the problem with these academic journals is there are these expensive paywalls, so you can't read the article unless you have access already through an academic institution, or you're willing to fork over like more money than is really reasonable. So if you have access to the academic journal, you might be able to read the whole article. But the abstract I thought was very interesting. I'm just going to read you the abstract and talk a little bit about this. Woven textiles from Cowichan in southern Anatolia, which is Turkey, are among the earliest known examples of weaving in the Near East and Europe. Studies of material excavated in the 1960s identified the fibers as flax. New scanning electron microscope analysis, however, shows these fibers and others from more recent excavations at the site to be made from locally sourced oak blast. So these are fibers from oak trees. And I believe the way that you access those is they would take the bark off and they would be able to access the fibers. And from what I've read before about different types of fibers from trees, they would have to harvest this at certain times of the year. But that's really fascinating to me that it's oak, it's not flax. This result is consistent with the near absence of flax seeds at Catalhoyuk, I know I'm pronouncing that wrong, and suggests that there was no need for the importation of fibers from elsewhere. It also questions the date at which domesticated flax was first used for fibers. These findings shed new light on early textile production in the Neolithic, suggesting tree bast played a more significant role than previously recognized. So some of the things I read in the past, I don't know, year or two about early string creation has suggested that it was usually tree fibers that were being used to create these fibers. Now, so these weren't necessarily fibers that were being woven into clothing or rugs or anything. They might have been just made to create twine that would be used to wrap around, say, a ceramic pitcher or something like that, or maybe used to tie two parts of a tool together, something like that. And if you don't know much about fibers, flax is the plant that you use in order to create linen. So linen is the name of the cloth that is created from flax. It has a long history in human textiles, and it's interesting to me that they're just finding more and more other fibers may have been used first. And I would be interested to know what these oak bast fibers were used for and the kinds of textiles. So if I can find more information, I'll share that with you. And if any of you have access to that article and could maybe share some of the information in it, I'm not suggesting that you send me the copy of it, but just what you learned from it in case you do have access to that. I got a message. I don't even know where I got it from. It was on Ravelry or Twitter, or I'm not even sure where. But the message was, if your interest in wool extends to historical spinning and weaving and clothing design, there's a terrific YouTube program called The Invention of the Trousers. It's produced by the German Archaeological Institute, but the program is in English. So I'm going to leave a link. It's a 45-minute YouTube video. And it's about a location in China. The archaeologists had a dig, and it's in a very dry area of China. And so there was this big area that was used as a cemetery or graveyard. And they discovered that there was some bodies, and they were digging them up, and they were incredibly well preserved. There was this body that had the clothing was intact, and that is what is so difficult with textiles, is they tend to degrade very quickly. But because of the really dry conditions, they had not. And now this was a much older body that had wearing trousers than they had ever seen before, and they were in such good condition. So the challenge with understanding these trousers is that often you don't have people who know a lot about textiles who are doing archaeological work. So this museum was working with different people in terms of figuring out how the fabric was woven and recreating it, because the fabric was woven in such a way that it was not cut. There were pieces that were sewn together, but everything that had the different shapes was woven that way. And then there were different, really more complex weaving techniques used at different points that would hit the body at different points in the trousers. And they were a really unusual shape. So the whole thing was this process of figuring out how these trousers were made, getting the cloth woven the right way, getting the yarn spun the correct way. In fact, they couldn't spin the quantity of fiber that they needed commercially. And so somebody who worked at the museum, an older man, had learned to spin when he was a child. He did the spinning at the museum, and then a weaver came in and did the weaving, and then they figured out how to construct them, and then they had somebody wear them. They got it all figured out, and then they figured out the occupation of the person who was wearing that clothing and why it was shaped the way it was, just based on all of this work they did on the trousers. Really, really fascinating. Before I learned to spin, there was a tool that I had heard of that's called a Noddy, and I had no idea what it was or what it was used for or how to use it. Once I learned to spin, a Noddy became an essential tool, but it still took me a little time to kind of get the hang of how to use it. So this is a Noddy. And in the one that I have, these heads right here, they rotate in this direction. Now I have some wool stuffed in here because these can, because they twist, they're not like glued on, and as the wool shrinks or swells during different parts of the year, sometimes these handles can fall off. So I have a little bit of wool in there to help keep them stuck. So you rotate them so that these little arms are perpendicular to each other. And when you are done spinning yarn onto a bobbin on your spinning wheel, you need to get it off this bobbin and turn into a yarn hank. And the way that you do that is through the use of a Noddy. So you wrap, that's how I do, I wrap the tail around, and then you create this path. Oh, I want to go this way. So that you are winding basically one big circle using these 4 arms that are sticking out. You create these big loops, and that is what, and then when you're done with that, you can tie them off, and then you take them off and you have a big hank like you might get if you were going to a yarn shop. You might buy yarn in hanks. So, and they come in different sizes. This one, that whole circuit would be 2 yards. So I know if I count how many strands I have, I can just multiply by that by 2, and that tells me how many yards I have. Well, a Noddy or things that are like this have been used as long as people have been spinning. And one of the things that I came across a couple of weeks ago, and I left really poor notes, and so I had to try to go search today and figure out exactly what it was. But it was about a Noddy that had been discovered in this old Viking grave. And the way it was described is the Orisberg Viking grave. And it was a big boat. And I couldn't understand, like, did the boat sink? Why was the boat on land? And what it was is they built this Viking ship. I think the idea was that in the afterlife, this would sail you to, is it Valhalla? Is that what the Vikings believed in? So the richer you were, you could have like a really elaborate boat and you'd have all your stuff in it. And so it was like the best preserved boat grave that they had ever found, and it was found in early like 1904. And there were 2 women who were buried in there, and they're obviously very wealthy. And so they had all of the belongings in there that they were going to need in the afterlife, including the things that they would need to do spinning. And one of those items was a Noddy. And I thought that was so fascinating that there were so many textile related things found in this grave. So I'm going to leave several links down below. There's a museum where you can see this ship, and like you can look at it at 360 degrees. The way that they have filmed it, you can have control of that. But there's also different websites that have pictures of the different things, including what this original Noddy looked like. Theirs, I don't believe, rotated. It would have looked pretty much just, more like that, but it had more of a curved ends. There are even sellers on Etsy who have replica Noddies from the Orisberg Viking ship available for sale if you want something that was like that. But I thought this was just fascinating. I always love finding any sort of history that is related to women and things and the tools that they would have used long ago. So this next tidbit is a video, was a video plus a Wikipedia article that I'm going to link to you. So the video is from a channel called Veritasium. It's a science-based channel that I've been subscribed to for many, many years. And I was watching the latest episode like a week or so ago, and he was exploring these brightly colored pools of water that were in the middle of the Utah desert and wondering, why are these here and what are they for? And the long story short, it's very interesting. So I would totally recommend watching it. The gist of it is those are pools of liquid potassium mining, basically. It's a very dangerous prospect to actually go underground and mine potassium. It's very volatile and you can explode things very easily. And what they found is if you can dissolve it with other things and then let it evaporate, you can collect this potassium. And the reason it's so important is it creates what is called potash, which I had heard of before, but I never knew what it was. So when potassium was discovered to be an element, the man who named it called it potassium. So that's where potassium gets its name from. But this video goes on to explain all of the uses that we have for different types of potassium compounds, I guess would be the word. We don't ever use pure potassium, just can't, it doesn't exist very well. And so it's always a compound of some sort. So I was watching this video and I thought it was really interesting. They learned that if you mixed it with like animal fat with potash, you could get like a liquid soap. If you mixed it with water and some bat guano, then you get this fertilizer, which helped to grow crops more efficiently. So there were just this endless number of uses for it. It became incredibly important to human civilization. But the way that they got it was by burning hardwood until it formed ash. And so there are these giant factories. The whole purpose was to burn up wood to create potash. So I grew up in Michigan, which before the Europeans came to settle it was wall-to-wall trees. And so a lot of them were cut down, and that was, a lot of people got rich. They were big lumber barons. I never once knew that the reason they were getting rich is because it was being used to create potash. I assumed it was being used as lumber to build houses or build buildings, or maybe as firewood or something. I never once knew anything about its use as potash. There is a connection to knitting. So I was looking up potash in the Wikipedia, and they were talking about all these different uses for it, and they were talking about potash pits that could be found all over England, and they were always near a wooded area. And sometimes these potash pits were used to wash wool. So they would shear the sheep, and they would take the fleece and they would soak it in this potash and animal fat mixture, which was a liquid soap, and that helped scour the fleece. And then they would also have these pits where they would do dyeing of the wool, which also used another form of potash. It was fascinating to me. I had no idea. So I'm going to leave a link also to the Wikipedia article. So to me, it's just a fascinating bit of human history that I had no idea of, but then there's this connection to knitting as well. This tidbit is one I've actually talked about previously to some extent, but somebody was reminding me of it in a DM this week, and it's about the show A Stitch in Time, which was hosted by Amber Bouchard. And what the series was about was looking at a famous piece of artwork and at the clothing that the subject of the artwork was wearing, and then figuring out how to recreate it using historical dressmaking and tailoring techniques. It's really interesting. The particular episode that somebody was reminding me of is the one about a painting, this Arnolfini paint portrait that's of a couple, a Dutch couple, and she's wearing this green dress, and so they recreated the green dress. And one of the purposes of doing this whole thing is to really understand what it feels like to wear these pieces of clothing, to see how the clothing would move as you would wear it, because you can't tell that by looking at a static photo. One of the things was really interesting to me about this particular episode was the process for dyeing the fabric. It's a green fabric, which meant that it was really expensive because it would require being dyed twice, one in blue dye and one in yellow dye. And one of the essential ingredients in dyeing was stale urine. Urine would be kept for 3 weeks, and then it would have turned to ammonia and could be used for all manner of things. They really seemed to use urine for a lot of things back in the day. And part of the reason is you didn't have a toilet that was flushing things away. People frequently used a chamber pot that would then get emptied into a container where the urine was held and then could be used for all sorts of purposes, like bleaching linen fabrics, or fulling wool fabrics, or in the case of this green dye, for dyeing fabrics. So there's certain materials that were used throughout, for all sorts of purposes, particularly with textiles. So I'm going to leave a link down below to the Stitch in Time series, as well as to a blog post that's called 5 Things to Do with Stale Urine in the Middle Ages, which I personally found fascinating. This first tidbit came to me from a text message from my husband. He's like, oh, I'm sure you've seen this already, but I'm going to give you this link anyway. And I hadn't seen it. In fact, it was fascinating. So it's actually a part 4A of a 4-part series on textile production in the pre-modern age. So I have not read the first 3 parts yet, but the way that they describe them is that this entire series is about the production of textiles in the pre-modern world, and that they started off with things like spinning and weaving and things like that. And they were mostly talking about household goods, so things that people would make in their homes for their own use. And what this particular part was talking about was things like dyeing and fulling. So these are specialized skills that would be done outside of the household. So it's a really fascinating article, and I'm looking forward to going back and reading the first 3 parts, which I have not seen yet. But I'll leave that link down below, as well as links to everything else I'm talking about in the tidbits. This next tidbit came to me in my Twitter feed. It is a link to a blog post on Kate Davies Designs, and it's the Sock of the Week. And this is Sock of the Week number 2. There was also one last week, which is equally as delightful as this week's. I will leave links down below. This week's Sock of the Week is actually a pair of miniature stockings that were made for a pair of dolls that are known as the Lord and Lady Clapham. They are held by the Victoria and Albert Museum. These dolls do not appear to have been intended for children to play with, but they include complete clothing, from their underwear all the way up to all of the different layers. But what's really interesting is their little stockings. So they're really fancy, and they were very similar to each other. Lord Clapham and Lady Clapham stockings were very similar to each other. Her blog post has a number of photographs of the dolls in different states of dress and undress. So I'm going to include links to not only the Kate Davies blog post, but also to the Victoria and Albert Museum. So for each of these items, Lord Clapham and Lady Clapham are separate, although there's a lot of overlap in the photos for each of them. So you'll be able to see quite a number of photos if you're interested. I just thought it was really amazing. And what was so interesting was a lot of times the underclothing isn't something that survives to this day. And so having these replicas of underclothing is really informative and interesting to be able to see. Last week, I was telling you guys about button societies and how they are often a gateway to finding vintage buttons, particularly if you're making a vintage sweater, or you're sewing something from a vintage pattern and you need, and you would really like to have vintage buttons. That button societies are often a way of finding those buttons. Billy from Show and Tell Knitting was looking for some buttons for a 1940s sweater that she was knitting. And I mentioned to her, oh, you should try Button Society. Well, she did. She actually did contact a local button society who had a seller liaison. And so she was able to get hooked up with somebody who could sell her exactly the perfect kind of button that she needed. So I thought that was pretty cool. And I just started thinking about the history of buttons. When I was reading more about button societies and how interested they are in the history of buttons, and I was just thinking, oh, what is the history of buttons? And I started Googling, and I found a really interesting video that's from a UK show that was filmed in the 1970s. And so somebody had recorded this show on a VHS tape, and then somebody transcribed it and put it up on Vimeo, which is it's a different video platform, streaming platform than YouTube. And apparently the presenter was a really famous guy, but he was talking about Dorset buttons, which I'd heard of and I'd seen before. And I'll put a picture of what a Dorset button is. But these were handmade buttons, and it was part of a cottage industry that was huge in the UK until about the mid-19th century, and then it really started to decline. Many of the people who had been involved in that cottage industry just couldn't make a living anymore when button making became mechanized. And so they emigrated from the UK, and many of them ended up here in the US or in Australia. And so I thought it was a really fascinating little documentary. It's maybe 15, 20 minutes long. But I also thought you might be interested in learning how to make Dorset buttons, because many people still like to make Dorset buttons for clothing items or for knitted items. So I'm going to leave a link to a little blog post from Piecework magazine that mentions an article that is in one of their magazines from 2018, but also there is how to make Dorset buttons as well. So you can read both of those things as well as see the video in the links down below. This tidbit came to me. I have been subscribed to a channel called Vlog Brothers for probably since the year that they started. I think it was 2007 or 9, somewhere. It was a long, long time ago. It's two brothers, John and Hank Green. Both of them are published authors. That was what John did when they started the channel. Hank has become an author since then. But they have really created a lot of educational content on YouTube through their channel on Crash Course, where they have entire high school courses, advanced high school courses on chemistry and history and all kinds of things. So they've done a lot for educational video content on YouTube, but they still do a weekly vlog. One of them posts on Tuesday and one of them posts on Friday, and they're talking to each other, but we're in on the conversation. So this week, John was telling the history of the woman who sort of invented stuffed animals. And he talks about how inventions are really just building on the previous work of somebody else. So she really invented the stuffed animal industry, and it's a fascinating story. She was Margareta Steiff, I think is her last name. She had polio. She was in the mid-19th century. She had polio, so she couldn't walk, and she had one arm that was really weak. She couldn't do regular needlework. She did learn to play a musical instrument called the zither, and then was able to earn money teaching other people to play the zither. Then, because she couldn't do handwork, she got the first sewing machine in her community using the money she'd earned from teaching music lessons, and then started making really high quality items using felt. and then started making stuffed animals, and then it just grew. And so she you know, at a time when women weren't expected to earn a living, never mind start a business, never mind being a disabled woman, running her own business. So I'm going to leave that video down below because I just find this kind of history really fascinating, and I love the connection to textiles as well. This tidbit showed up in my Twitter feed. It's about a woman named Harriet Powers, who was born into slavery in 1837 near Athens, Georgia. She was known as a really amazing quilt maker. She won all sorts of prizes, and her work was exhibited during her lifetime. And only 2 of her quilts are known to still survive. One is held in the Museum of Fine Art in Boston, and the other by the Smithsonian Institution. And her story is fascinating to me. People really loved her quilts, but at the same time, she was somewhat taken advantage of, as makers even today can be taken advantage of. There was somebody who really admired her quilts and wanted to buy one from her, and she didn't allow it. But then later, when she was in real financial need, she agreed to sell one. She gave a price of $10 to the woman who wanted to buy it, and who then talked her down to $5. It makes me so mad just thinking about it. I'll leave links to images of her quilts down below so you can take all the time that you would like really examining them, because they are really, really amazing. This next tidbit came to me from Edgehill on Ravelry, who gave me a link to this. It's an article, an online article on the story of the Cowichan sweaters. So Cowichan sweaters are, or Cowichan, they're a traditional type of sweater knit by native people in the Northwest area. Like, I think it might be on Vancouver Island or that kind of area on the west coast of Canada. And so knitting was introduced to these people by European immigrants, and then they developed their own sort of traditional style. So I'll have a picture of what a Cowichan sweater or Cowichan sweater is, so you can see it. You'll probably recognize that style once you see it. But it's a really interesting article that I think that you might be interested in reading, and I thank Edgehill for sending the link. This next tidbit came to me, I believe, through Instagram or Twitter, possibly both. I think it came from the Fleece to Fashion social media feed. And it is a row counter. It's what's called a complex row counter. So this is from early in the 20th century, and it was a way of keeping track of things like shaping and pattern repeats and all that kind of thing. I just thought it was a really interesting mechanical method of keeping track of where you are in a pattern. These days, many people use apps on their phone or on a tablet. I tend to use a combination of spreadsheets, charts, and putting things physically on my knitting to help me keep track of where I am. But I'm always fascinated to see what other knitters have come up with at different points and what helps different people at different times. So this tidbit is directly related to the Center for Knit and Crochet. I decided I was just going to kind of browse through and see what they had on their website, and I literally just went to their database and I said hit browse, and I started looking, and one of the first things I found was this photograph, which is the front cover of a piece of sheet music that dates back to World War I. And the title of the song is "And Then She Knit, Knit, Knit," with the words by Eddie Moran and music by Harry Van Tisler. So I followed that link. It's actually part of the Smithsonian Institution, owns that particular piece of sheet music, and they have a little bit of information about the date and the publisher and things like that. One of the things that drives me crazy about hearing about these old songs that were related to knitting is that I never have been able to hear them. I've only heard of them, maybe heard a title for one of them or seen the cover of the sheet music or something like that. So I decided to do some Googling to see if I could find the lyrics maybe, or maybe there would be a recording somehow. And what I found was a woman named Melanie Gall, who's a bit of she's a singer and a historian. She did an entire CD of knitting songs from World War I. And you can listen to it on Spotify. I'm going to leave a link to her website so you can learn about all the different things she's done. And from her website, you can see the titles of all her CDs, and you can listen to a few songs from each of the CDs. But I was able to find it on Spotify. I'll link to her artist page on Spotify as well. But not only did she do a CD about knitting songs from World War I, she did one on knitting songs from World War II as well. So I spent some time this morning listening to some of these old songs. It's just amazing how many of them that there actually were. Knitting was extremely popular during World War I and World War II. So the songs, some of the songs are about, you know, her boyfriend's gone off to fight the war and she's back home knitting, or maybe men are trying to get her attention, but she's just knit all day long. So there's a variety of different types of songs. So they're obviously very different than contemporary music is, but it's fantastic to be able to get a sense of what these songs really were like. This first tidbit came to me in my Wednesday morning knitting group in the park where we've been meeting this summer. Many of you will know that I have a long-term project that I'm working on where I'm knitting a sweater from each decade from the 1890s to the 1990s. And part of that long-term project is knitting sweaters, yes, but it's also to really take a look at how construction methods have changed and how knitting patterns themselves have changed. Like, how have the instructions changed in different time periods? And what happened in my knitting group a few weeks ago is that one of the other women brought a vintage, what's called a sweater wheel, to the group because she thought I'd be interested in it. And I thought it was fascinating, and I thought it was a fascinating difference in how a multi-size, multi-yarn weight presentation of how to knit a specific type of sweater, how that could be presented to a knitter. I went and found my own copy of the sweater wheel. In fact, I found two different versions on eBay and got them, and have been really interested in comparing how those sweater instructions were the same or different from what we might see in more contemporary versions of that kind of pattern presentation. So let's go to the overhead and I'll show you what I have. What I found was that there were actually two different versions of the sweater wheel. This one is for set-in sweaters. You'll see it says 360 set-in sweaters, and this one is 360 raglan sweaters. I bought the two of these off of eBay for very little money. It really ranges how much these cost. And when I went to pull it out of the bag, I realized it probably had never, ever been out of the bag before. It was like in brand new condition. So I want to show you what these are like, because different eras have similar ways of presenting multiple sizes of the same type of garment. I just kind of want to show what this is like. So on one half of the wheel, you'll have adult sizes. So we have a misses, a women's, and men's sizes here. They tell you to read first. And so they have three different ranges of sizes. I think there's 6 sizes for, misses, women's, and men's. And then any sweater could be knit in one of 3 different yarn weights. Well, they have the gauges down here. So there's 8 stitches and 10 rows over an inch, which is multiplied by 4, 32 stitches, 40 rows over 4 inches or 10 centimeters, 6 and 8, and then 5 and 7. So they tell you how you read this first, you figure out which yarn weight you're going to use and what needle size you'll probably need in order to get the gauge that is required. So as always, it's the gauge that you're trying to get, and if you need a different needle size than what they tell you, then you should use that different needle size. It's not the needle size that's important, it's the gauge. And then you start here, and you're starting the back for the set-in sleeve. They tell you how much of yarn that you're going to need for a given size. So if I am dialing a, let's say, these are old sizing systems. These are not the same as they would be today, but a 14 was a 36-inch bust. And so they were selling, apparently they were selling fingering weight yarn in 1-ounce skeins, and you'd need 11 of them for this size. If you were going to use sport weight, they were sold in 2-ounce skeins, and you'd need 7. If you were going to get worsted weight, they'd be sold in 4-ounce skeins, and you'd need 5 of them. So this tells you your yarn requirements. And then they tell you how many stitches that you need to cast on with that particular yarn weight. So if you're using the thin yarn, 146, the sport 110, and worsted weight 92. So they're telling you each of the steps and what you need to do at each time. They're showing you where to measure for the beginning of the back up to the armhole when you're doing the shaping. So they're giving you the silhouette shape, and they just walk you through each thing. And if you're doing a cardigan, you're going to be doing a left front or right front. And they just have all of the instructions, and here's the instructions for the front. So this is for all of the adult sizes, and then on the back, then you have sizes for everything from a baby and toddlers, then you have children, then you have what they're calling sub-teen, I guess we call it a tween today, boys teen, a junior, which would be a girls teen. So they have a bunch of different sizes, and it's the same process for all of that. And so I just thought that was fascinating, because this is just another way of doing sort of the pick your gauge, pick your size type of knitting that we can see in other publications, both prior to this, at the same time as this, and then what we have in contemporary times. So, up till about 1950, everything came, the sweaters they came in one size. And it was up to you to make the modifications to size it up or down. So I have this book from the 1950s, and they're advertising every size, every weight, every style, which is a big claim, and it's maybe a larger claim than is actually true. They're talking about all the different sizes here, but not every sweater in this book comes in every one of those sizes. What you'll see is, like, for example, this one comes in 2 sizes, one size that fits sizes 12 to 14 and one that fits sizes 16 to 18. And they have one particular yarn weight that they're being called for. So what they're meaning by this is that there's a variety of sweaters in here that are graded for multiple sizes, and any type of yarn weight you might want to use would be included in here, just not necessarily for every sweater. There are some sweaters that come in, multiple sizes. This one comes in 5 sizes. This one comes in, 5 sizes as well. And so they have this kind of charting situation, which is very similar to that wheel, but it's just laid out sort of in a more linear charted fashion. This is, I think, from the 60s, but before that sweater wheel, men's classics, all styles, all weights, all sizes to 46. So this is a little bit more where they really they have all these different yarn weights, and the sweaters do tend to be, like this one, you might have a couple of different yarn weight choices, and for a range of sizes. And again, it's that kind of charted method of, here's how we're going to go through this, and here's what you're going to do for the different yarn weights. And they tend to be fairly simple sweaters and these kinds of things, because those are going to be the easiest to design for multiple sizes and multiple yarn weights. You're not going to have to worry about pattern symmetry or anything like that. All you have to do is worry about your stockinette stitch. Some of these have cables in them. This is an interesting one. It does come in a couple of different yarn weights, and it's got a really the reason I bought this book is because of that particular shawl collar construction. I was interested in that. So you do see that kind of thing. It's different from the sweater wheel. I mean, the woman who came up with this sweater wheel patented this in 1969. So this was, a pretty new idea. Nowadays, we have these kinds of books like from Ann Budd. And this type of book even expands those sizes further, where it goes from like a size 2 child up to a man's extra large. And these will include all different types of sweaters, but also there'll be schematics so that you can see how long everything is, and that makes it much easier up front to know if you're going to need to make a modification in some way. But they, saddle shoulder sweaters, set-in sleeve, modified drop, and drop shoulders. And then you can do a crew neck or a turtleneck or a V-neck or any of those kinds of things. And she does talk about how to incorporate stitch patterns other than stockinette as well in these books. So she's got, this one is the older book. It's these sweaters were knit bottom up, and this is a newer version, and this one is for top-down sweaters. But again, multiple sizes and multiple gauges. So for me, this has been a fascinating thing to see that once sweaters were actually offered in multiple sizes, how did they take that next step to allow a knitter even more flexibility than just the size, but also the yarn weight, and eventually a really wide range of sizes for whatever type of sweater they were interested in knitting. This first tidbit came to me across my Twitter feed. It's a link to a BBC article about a special type of muslin that hadn't been seen in 100 years. And what I mean by that is no one has been able to weave this type of fabric for 100 years. The knowledge of how to do it has been lost, and the knowledge of how to make the threads that are used to weave this fiber have been lost, and the cotton that was grown to produce the fiber that the thread was spun from was extinct. And so it was something that had been made for thousands of years. It was well known, and it was sold to various places around the world. The Romans used this type of fabric themselves, and it was really expensive and highly sought after. And so I'm going to leave that article, a link to the article down below, because it's really interesting to read about what this muslin was like, and also the man who is trying to revive it and bring that skill back and bring back the cotton that could produce this fabric is interesting. But there was one thing in the article that I found confusing, which was when they were talking about how fine the fabric is, they were talking about thread count. And they said that this Dhaka muslin had a thread count of 300, which means that there are 300 threads per square inch. So in every inch, there are 150 threads horizontal and 150 vertical. And they talked about this as being an order of magnitude finer than anything that we see today. And I found that confusing because 300 thread count sheets are very common, and some manufacturers will even claim that they have 600, 900, 1200 thread count. And so I thought there's something that I'm missing, or there's something about that terminology that does not agree. Like whatever the bedsheet manufacturers are using as thread count is not what they're talking about in this article. And so I looked it up, and sure enough, sheet manufacturers, when they talk about thread count, they're counting every single ply in a thread rather than counting the thread as one thread, and the thread could be made up of 2 or 3 plies. They're not counting it that way, and that's how they fudge the numbers. And then on top of it, they just exaggerate how many threads they have per inch. So I think that's useful to know before you read the article. But again, I will leave that down below. Well, that's it for the 200th episode of Casual Friday, the 50th episode of Season 4. The Casual Friday playlist with all 200 episodes is available over here. And in addition, I have more than 250 technique videos available on my channel. I hope you all have a wonderful new year and that 2022 brings us all new adventures in our knitting explorations. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next year for Season 5.